Oh, where and when were you born?
Um, in Leicester, in the Midlands, in the kind of slap bang in the centre of the UK, if you like. Well, certainly in the middle of England, anyway. In a hospital of all places, in back in '72,
And
I
what month?
believe.
I'm interested in people's astrological signs.
Oh, so February 12.
So Aquarian or
Yeah,
Pisces?
that's right.
Aquarian.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
McGrath.
yeah, I sent you the some of the compilations, and so far there's been more Sagittarians, like a statistically improbable number of Sagittarians.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, my wife's Sagittarius.
Ah, does she do this kind of work?
Not really, no. She's a novelist actually, so
But
but
she's
she's
thinking
interested in
outside
it.
the box.
Yeah. Oh, definitely, definitely.
Okay. Do you know your Myers-Briggs? Have you had a chance to take that?
I don't actually. I think I'm more on the kind of intuitive feeling side of things, but on the other end, the other kind of indices, I'm not really entirely sure. But
When you have a
yeah,
chance, take the. I sent the link to it,
yeah,
to the QC.
good.
And birth order.
So I'm the youngest of seven.
Wow. How did
Catholic,
that happen? Was your family Catholic, or may I
Catholics,
ask?
yeah, Catholics, yeah, of course.
Oh, how interesting. And then, were you raised as a devout Catholic boy? Did you want to be a priest?
No, I didn't want to be a priest, but I was raised Catholic. I kind of became disenamored with it at about just after my confirmation, after about age 11 or so. I was it didn't answer enough kind of questions I had, and I saw it as a bit of a construct really, and so yeah, I kind of moved away from Catholicism quite early on.
Well, 11's pretty young to be thinking that abstractly. That's interesting.
Yeah, well, I was always asking big questions which I never had answers to, so and it kind of fell short basically.
And what did you replace it with? Where did you find some of the answers?
I started reading lots of kind of left field science books. Basically, I'd often just kind of bunk off school and go to the second-hand bookshop in the town and read all the kind of, the bookshelf they have with all the kind of mystical science and stuff like that. Like kind of classic books. Like Supernature and things like that, that kind of style of books. If you remember that, the author of that, I can't recall his name right now. um, Lyle Watson, that was the classic book. So anything on the kind of like, the occult and kind of parapsychological and psychical research kind of shelf of books, I'd kind of get into very much.
Interesting. And then in high school, were you kind of a mod or a rocker? Or what group did you?
Oh yeah, I was very much a rocker. Yeah, for sure. There was a kind of little group of us, about 5 or 6, and kind of safety in numbers really, because we'd all kind of get bullied for being freaks, but we were kind of safe as a small group in a way. But we're all pretty much kind of not kind of being very conventional,
Mm-hmm.
although it might be considered conventional in his own way, but we were not the kind of going with the usual kind of trends, basically.
And then, why did you decide to go to university to study psychology?
So I got thrown out of school in sixth form at a kind of college, and but then I kind of developed an interest in psychedelics and psychology in particular. I thought it could explain some of the more kind of wild experiences of mystical experiences, and so I went away specifically to study psychology to try and understand the psychedelic experience. But of course, was kind of woefully disappointed when I got to university and did a whole psychology degree and learned practically nothing about mystical or psychedelic experiences.
Why did
So
you
I had
get
to carry on studying.
Why did you get tossed out of college? College is
Uh,
like upper
uh,
secondary in England, right?
Yeah, because I wasn't really doing very much work. My mock exams were pretty bad. I was just kind of like I was just having a good time. I was actually growing marijuana in the common room, which didn't help. That was the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. I was looking at it from a kind of as a science experiment.
Of
I mean, they
course.
were tiny, like they were literally only about this big. But that was the kind of the final straw, and they threw me out.
Well, then how did you get accepted to university? You did well on A levels.
No, so I kind of I didn't take my exams the first time round, and then I I spent a couple of years working on the roads and running nightclubs, and then I went back to kind of night school and got some qualifications, and then got to university that way.
Mm-hmm. And were you a musician yourself?
No, but I always wanted to be. I think that was my kind of primary calling was to be a rock star. But I didn't actually play any musical instruments, so that didn't really help.
But you produced shows and you were part of the organization.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, we used to party and dance and listen to lots of music. Yeah, but I was never really very musically talented, unfortunately. So yeah, I had to kind of find an alternative career.
Mm-hmm. Um, what about meditation? A lot of people that I've interviewed are meditators, and they find it kind of helps make things easier when they're dealing with this going up against the stream effort.
Yeah, well, I spent a lot of time doing yoga, and certainly in the past, I studied yoga kind of fairly intensively for a few years, and I kept up my practice. Although I don't have much of a practice these days because I kind of juggle three part-time jobs and a 3-year-old child, so it doesn't leave much time. So my practice has kind of slid away a bit, to say the least. But yeah, I very much value kind of Eastern meditative traditions and esoteric traditions as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, that leads to a question I wanted to ask you. You've written or co-written 8 books, 26 peer-reviewed journal articles, 31 book chapters, 11 book reviews, 13 review articles. You teach at University of Greenwich and Northampton. You're president of the Parapsychological Association, director of the Ecology, Cosmos, and Consciousness Salon at the Institute of Ecotechnics, co-founder and director of Breaking Convention, multidisciplinary conference on psychedelic consciousness, plus, as you say, a child and a wife. How do you manage to do all that?
I guess I don't have much of a social life or something. I'm not entirely sure. I guess I work quite hard, or at least I have done. I guess for me, working as a mainstream academic, in a university, I figured I had to work that a little bit harder just to establish myself because I was in a kind of taboo research area pretty much. 2 taboo research areas, both kind of psychedelic research and parapsychology. So that's kind of driven me to kind of make sure I can keep my job even though I'm kind of out there on the liminal edges. Mm-hmm. So just dedicated, and I really enjoy the research I do and the work I've done. So it has its own internal kind of engine, if you like, its own mechanisms of motivation.
Do you not sleep very much?
Oh, these days, no, not for the last 3 years since having a child. I've kind of, yeah, I was averaging about 5 hours a night for about the first 18 months, and now got up to a whopping 7 hours a night, which is, that's reasonable. That seems like luxury. But I don't really have days off very often.
No, absolutely not. When I had my baby, I remember teaching, and a student would ask a question, and there would be this time lag before my brain could click in because I was so tired because he woke up every 2 or 3 hours. So your brain changes from sleep deprivation.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think once you've had that prolonged sleep deprivation, it's hard to revert to actually having a decent amount of sleep again. So yeah, I've kind of got used to it now.
You teach a course on this new kind of parapsychology. Why does the university let you teach it? It's called Psychology of Exceptional Human Experience.
I think, well, I was lucky in that there was already somebody at the university in the psychology department who was researching a little bit about parapsychology. He wasn't teaching anything on it though, and I ended up taking his job. He was on long-term sick, and then eventually left, and so I kind of filled his place and started my own course about 10 years ago, and it seemed to be very popular with the students. I mean, it was always oversubscribed, so they seemed to be happy with it in the department. They liked the diversity. I think privately some of the people in the department thought it was a bit bonkers, but the students liked it, which is great. So and these days I think my peers somewhat accept me, for my all my quirks. So yeah, I've never really had too much resistance to it, really. I think it's been it's because it is intrinsically interesting and people are interested in it. I think, they're more intrigued than horrified generally, my colleagues, and the students are very interested in it. So that's probably been the reason I've managed to get away with doing that.
Mm-hmm. Could you say a word about parapsychology research in the UK? It start at Edinburgh with an endowed chair, and then those grad students kind of spread through England, or what's the history of it?
Yeah, of course. Well, it started before that in 1882 with the formation of the Society for Psychical Research. Although it was never really an academic subject in within the universities until the endowed chair in parapsychology, which I think started in the 1980s or thereabouts at Edinburgh. And yeah, Bob Morris, who was the professor there, who had the chair, he kind of seeded all these other universities with Ph.D. students. I think he supervised maybe 30 or 40 Ph.D. students. John Beloff, who was also at Edinburgh, also supervised a lot of other students as well. And between them, they had this kind of diaspora of about 40 or 50 PhDs, which went off, many of which went to other institutions, and then also started spawning their own PhD students, like myself. My own supervisor had been did their own PhD at Edinburgh too, and so there's this kind of legacy of this kind of extended family down to the kind of fourth and even fifth generation now of people who have studied parapsychology within the academic system in the UK and are teaching at various universities. I did a kind of tally a few years ago, and I think there was about 15 universities where they're either teaching or researching parapsychology. So it's fairly well embedded in the UK academic system in the UK, which is great.
Yeah, and I heard somewhere that Edinburgh doesn't really do that kind of work anymore.
No, sadly. So after Bob Morris died, the chair was left open for many years. In fact, it's never really been filled. What they did do, there was a bit of controversy around it because they didn't reappoint a professor, although they did advertise the post. They didn't appoint anybody. They didn't think anyone was suitable. And what happened is that they used the money to employ two lecturers, senior lecturers. One of which has now become a professor, but she doesn't have the endowed chair. So the unit is still open, the Kersler Parapsychology unit, but it's pretty much a one-woman or one-man show. So it's kind of hugely diminished compared to how it used to be. And I think Caroline, who runs the unit still, Caroline Watt, sorry.
Watt.
Yeah, and I think she has a couple of PhD students, but it's nothing like it was in its kind of Bob Morris days and its kind of scope and grandeur.
Mm-hmm.
Since that time, the University of Northampton has kind of taken that kind of pivotal role, that primary role, and Professor Chris French has a team of academic staff and PhD students. I think they number at least a dozen, if not 15 or 20 PhDs and postgrads who are kind of working and researching both parapsychology and transpersonal psychology there.
A lot of times that seems to go together. It may seem obvious, but could you explain why people who do parapsychology come out of transpersonal psych?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously they're quite different in their approach. I mean, they both explore very similar subject matter, anomalous or exceptional experiences or parapsychological experiences. Transpersonal psychology is probably broader, includes a whole range of spiritual experiences, which parapsychology may not necessarily delve into. So they have a huge amount of overlap. But parapsychology is rooted in the kind of empirical approach and looks to understand the underlying mechanisms of psi and related phenomena, and also establish the reality of it. Whereas transpersonal psychology is more interested in the transformative process of having one of these experiences, how having a transpersonal experience can develop the individual as a kind of transpersonal being, if you like. And so it has a very different agenda, really. But there is a huge overlap, and certainly in the subject matter. And I think they're easy bedfellows, at least, although the approaches are quite different.
Mm-hmm. And what led to your interest in psychedelics? I think it's fair to assume that you experimented with ayahuasca and or LSD, definitely herb. What?
Yeah, I mean, I got interested in earlier. I think I always had a kind of a proclivity for exploring altered states, and I'm fascinated by all altered states of consciousness. And I don't just research psychedelics. I mean, the broader area is altered states and exceptional experiences. But I got particularly interested in psychedelics as a teenager anyway, and that interest has always continued. And just so both on a personal level, but also on a research level. So I've done various experiments. I've been out to South America and done research with ayahuasca and San Pedro cactus. I've spent a lot of time working with indigenous tribes, mostly in Mexico, who make use of peyote cactus. I've run clinical drug trials in hospitals with LSD and conducted experiments in laboratories with LSD and doing research with DMT. So I've done a lot of kind of both research and kind of personal research, if you like, exploring the psychedelics. And I think that they're hugely of interest. I think, altered states in general are hugely of interest for exceptional experiences, but psychedelic substances also give us the benefit of we can understand more the underlying neurobiological kind of processes at work as well. So if we use these tools to look at exceptional experiences, then we can have a bit more of an insight into the neuroscience that's also going on. So from a research perspective, they are kind of hugely fascinating. But I've also just been deep. The brain is not so much a producer of consciousness, it's a filter of consciousness, and it acts like a reducing valve. And then he said, the first time we tried psychedelics, mescaline in this case, he said, and psychedelics are these agents which can turn off the reducing valve of the brain, allowing you access to what he called mind at large, consciousness with a big C. So I think it's an interesting notion. I'm certainly open to it. I don't think materialist reductionism is adequate as for explaining the mind-body relationship. I'm not sure any explanation is adequate. Really, consciousness is a complete enigma, and we however long we've been trying to understand it, we've not really kind of nailed it down yet. So I'm open to all interpretations. I know that materialist reductionism isn't satisfactory. I think the filter theory is worth kind of exploring. It kind of suggests a kind of dualism, that mind and body are somehow separate. But yeah, I think we have to be open to interpretations. I'm not really much of a philosopher or theorist particularly, so I think I look to the data, and the data would seem to suggest that consciousness, you can have, extended mind experiences of consciousness. Consciousness seems to occur even beyond the brain itself. Okay, so that would seem to suggest that the brain doesn't necessarily produce consciousness, which is, of course, just a working hypothesis and an assumption anyway. So I think in my position, I'm looking to find the mechanisms and the processes by which we can have genuine experiences of extended mind, and what's going on in the brain in those situations. So what are the parallels between the neurobiology of psychedelic experiences, which give rise to exceptional experiences, and those occurring under other induction mechanisms, such as through meditation or hypnosis or flotation tanks or near-death experiences and so on, and what are the parallels and what brain mechanisms are part of the process. Huxley famously said psychedelics aren't the cause of mystical experiences; they're more the occasion. So it's like it's part of the process, the mechanism. But I think to just look to the brain as the complete explanation of the experience is somewhat limiting, particularly when these experiences seem to indicate people are having genuine, non-brain mediated experiences of a exceptional kind, be it, out-of-body experiences with veridical visions or experiences of telepathy or precognition. Look at the evidence of blind people, congenitally blind people having a near-death experience, where they report seeing things for the first time in their life. I mean, so how does that actually occur? So yeah, I look to the anomalies in the data set and how we can explore these. So most of my research and experiments are kind of directed in that way.
So if you were pressed to define what that consciousness is that people have a glimpse of in altered states, what would you guess that it is?
That's a really good question. What would I guess that it is? I would say I don't know. I mean, I'm agnostic. I try to remain agnostic. For all intents and purposes, a materialist explanation is deeply unsatisfactory, and I'm not sure that the alternatives are well enough fleshed out either, quite literally fleshed out. And it's the old hard problem of consciousness, But what I would say is that I'm not convinced by materialism, and I'm open to other explanations, be it panpsychism or some kind of dualism.
What's panpsychism?
Panpsychism, it's kind of like a middle ground. So it suggests that everything is inherently conscious, from brains down to atoms and perhaps even quarks, and even perhaps aggregates of things like organisms, and so on and so forth. It usually draws a line at saying that sofas and wardrobes are conscious, but I would argue that the grounds for drawing the line aren't really well established either. For instance, the human organism is composed of trillions of cells, and yet we experience it we experience ourselves as being an individual, and yet trillions of those cells are not even of human origin.
Viruses and bacteria and
absolutely all our microbiome, even within the cells, we have kind of foreign bodies in a way, and yet we experience ourselves as this kind of a whole, as an individual. But panpsychism is a useful concept, and I think it's growing, it's gaining acceptance, increasing interest, I think, in philosophy and even within neuroscience as a possible means of looking at the mind-body problem. But I don't think anybody's got the explanation yet. I mean, I think people kind of have their different camps, but I think to be truly honest on the nature of consciousness and how it relates to material, just to be agnostic, I mean truly agnostic, and just be open to all possible explanations, but see the limitations in all of them.
What's interesting to me is that in near-death experiences and mystical experiences, there's emotion of love. So there's this enormous feeling of love. And so that implies something transcendental, that emotion. It's something that you can't in any way put in a test tube. So consciousness in some ways is related to love.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting notion. It's certainly something that pops up a lot in mystical experiences. Not exclusively, but a lot of mystical experiences can be are very notable for these experiences of profound and deep love that people experience. And love itself is a qualia, is something of consciousness that it doesn't easily fit into a materialist perspective. So I think love is something to be explored as an enigma and a conundrum of the human condition, but it transcends the human condition even. I mean, we can experience love with and for everything in the universe, and experience it as though the universe has love for us as well. It's a good curveball to throw in there for all your materialist neuroscientists out there and physicalists and so on. Yeah, I think, and it deserves further exploration. It's also, we find that, people who have profound mystical experiences tend to have personality changes as well. They tend to be more compassionate and more empathic. They have more concern for nature and the people around them. And they tend to have more openness for experience. They tend to be just that more kind of open and connected to everyone and everything around them, following their experiences as a general rule, which would seem to be driven by this force of love, whatever that is, the undefinable.
Well, some people call it God.
Yeah, quite. Yeah, I mean, it could well be. Of course, God's a tricky concept to stick into a scientific paradigm as well. Almost as tricky as love. But yeah, love is a good denominator, I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, carry on.
Before we go more into your research, I wanted to ask you what the most difficult experiences have been in your life, the biggest challenges, and how you coped, because I think that's of real value to readers.
On a professional level?
Any level.
Yeah, I mean, just I guess just all the usual existential stuff on a personal level. Who are we, and what are we, and what are we doing on the planet? What do humans mean? What does it mean to exist? What does existence mean? So the ontological challenges are the ones which I kind of chew over on a daily basis and never really have fully received answers to. But and they're the kind of questions you can struggle with as well, of course, at various points in your life. Certainly as a young adult, or those kind of existential questions about identity and who I am. They're usually more on a kind of social and psychological level. But I tend to think more of the kind of larger kind of ontological questions these days. What is the nature of reality itself? And it is the great mystery, really. But I think as long as we're kind of constantly asking that question, it also is deeply nourishing too. It kind of the quest for understanding, or the search for truth, creates its own meaning. It gives existence meaning. in a world which is feels like meaning is constantly being stripped away. According to materialist reductionism, everything is meaningless. According to kind of social materialism, as in capitalism and constant acquisition and perpetual economic growth and development, everything also becomes somewhat meaningless as well. So in our quest for meaning, I think asking these bigger existential and ontological questions, it can give us meaning, or at least the search itself becomes meaningful. So that on a personal level, there's some of the kind of the big questions and problems, and on a professional level, just coping and struggling with working in some pretty taboo research areas. Although I've always found that a kind of challenge and a game, actually, because I started off from a position of very low expectations, and have always been astonished with how much I could get away with, really, and how far into the left field you can take your research and still maintain some academic respectability and position. Mm-hmm. So I've always enjoyed that challenge, although it has been somewhat frustrating at times. But I've always embraced it, with the appropriate amount of expectations that anything is a bonus, really.
I taught women's studies, and it was the same kind of thing, that people just think of you as some kind of radical, weird person. So it gives you a fair amount of freedom, because they're not surprised whatever you do. They expect you're going to do something that's left field.
Quite. And can I ask you, did you find many obstacles in your path in that kind of career trajectory?
Yes. Like an example is my Ph.D. is in religious studies, and the provost at the university here was unhappy with something, and he said, you have a degree in religious studies, you better start praying. And he tried to get rid of me, and he would have if the union hadn't stepped in. He tried to make new requirements after being hired, that I be accepted by a traditional department, that kind of thing.
Right.
So I ended up in sociology, and I'd never taken a sociology class in my life. So they weren't tremendously happy about that. Yeah, so it was difficult, but as you say, if you persist and have allies, don't try to go it alone, then I became full prof.
Oh, fantastic! That's good. That's good to know. So I don't think I've met quite that many direct frontal challenges, career existential threats. But progression has been difficult, and funding is in short supply, certainly. But I'm always amazed that there is still some amount of intellectual freedom within the academy, although it seems to be diminishing.
Really?
Well, I mean, I think it becomes increasingly more challenging as universities in the UK are becoming more and more corporate. Pure intellectual pursuits are disappearing. Like philosophy departments and anthropology and humanities, botany. These kind of subjects are kind of evaporating as universities just become more kind of geared towards applied and industrial research and bringing in grants and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true throughout the Western world. In your own personal use of psychedelics, did you find that you did experience this bliss, love, expansion? Because you also hear about people who are terrified and, see demons and are petrified in their experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And as actually Aldous Huxley, in conjunction with Humphrey Osmond, actually it was Humphrey Osmond, the English psychiatrist, who gave Huxley mescaline, and together they coined the term psychedelic, and meaning mind manifesting. And Osmond came up with this little rhyme to go along with it. It's kind of to fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. And in that, it can take you to either extreme. I would say on mass, typically people tend to have more positive experiences, and a lot of that's to do with the setting, the context in which you take them, and the preparation you've had. But I also think that to really soar to the heavens, you also have to plumb the depths as well. So, like, the deeper into the shadow or the sewers that you delve, the higher you can fly as well. I think to do any kind of mystical work with oneself, to kind of just ignore the shadow is A, limiting, and B, probably an impossibility, because unless you've done the work and dug down deep into those kind of terrifying and traumatic spaces, you really can't get that elevated. And you may have a few kind of blissful journeys, but you've really got to kind of dig down deep as well. So I think the expectation that it should only be blissful is possibly a limiting factor, and that way, you're going to have a kind of some disappointments and some kind of perhaps unprepared for terrifying moments.
Jung explained that to us, that if you don't become conscious of the shadow, you project it, and it governs your life in lots of ways, the shadow.
Absolutely. And I think that's the benefit of doing this work, not just with psychedelics, but this kind of deep psychological process, be it with meditation or whatever path it is, in that you confront the shadow, and you do dig deep into those psychologically sticky areas, otherwise, they can be the things that you just drag around with you throughout your whole life and don't actually really engage with. And typically in a kind of psychedelic psychotherapeutic session, people will go to very dark spaces. They'll traverse into the long, dark tea time of the soul, and visit Chapel Perilous, and then hopefully find some resolution and catharsis, and then come through into a more blissful state. So in the period of one psychedelic experience, you can plumb the depths and soar angelic, though usually not at the same moment,
Right. You probably know Michael Pollan at Berkeley, who has a new book out, and where he talks about the use of psychedelics to cope with mental illness, with depression and anxiety, I think. What's your experience with using those kind of drugs for depression, anxiety, which is such a modern, increasing problem, especially for young people, especially for girls?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anxiety and depression are modern epidemics, and I think they're increasing. And psychiatry is somewhat in crisis, unlike other areas of medicine, which have steadily progressed over the last 100 years. My psychiatric colleagues tell me the best treatment for depression is still ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, which has huge kind of problems to it, terrible side effects and so on. So psychiatry is still very much in the kind of early stages of development, and the drugs that they currently have aren't particularly effective. They're only slightly better than placebo. They take several weeks to start working. They have terrible side effects. They're addictive. They have a whole range of their own kind of baggage and problems come along with them. And the preliminary research with psychedelics is extremely promising in treating difficult, psychogenic disorders like depression, anxiety, addictions, and so on. So I haven't used them personally for that particular purpose. But certainly, the research is extremely promising, and that's how they were explored initially in the 50s and 60s. And of course, then they've just been dormant for 40, 50 years, and now we're seeing this renaissance of interest in psychedelics, both clinically and as research tools, etc. So I think it's hugely promising.
What part of the brain do they act upon to alleviate depression, anxiety, etc.?
I don't think that's well understood as yet, because the neuroimaging research is still very much in the early stages as well. Of course, in the 50s and 60s, they didn't have very advanced neuroimaging or neurobiological research techniques. They had EEG, but now we have fMRI, MEG, and so on. But some of the early findings and theories would suggest that they work in opposite ways to classic antidepressants like SSRIs, which seem to kind of deaden your emotional responses. So these, you have an intensification of your emotional response, and it can lift people out of their repetitive negative thought loops. We also find that there's an increase of activity in the frontal cortex, the rumination, basically, in depression of this kind of going over the same negative loops. You get stuck in this rut. Everything, nothing seems to lift you out of it. You're always kind of returning to these kind of negative thought patterns, thought loops. And psychedelics reduce activity in the frontal cortex, so that may be one of the mechanisms. They also stimulate neurogenesis, the development of new kind of neural connections as well in the brain, laying down new memory traces. So there's various kind of rudimentary theories about how they may act to kind of reduce depression, for instance, in the brain. But I'd say it's still early days, because they work in numerous ways in the brain. They also disrupt this kind of central hub function of what's called the default mode network, which is kind of like your kind of ego control mechanism, and then open up this kind of unconstrained cognition, so that you have hyperconnectivity between different brain regions. So there's a huge degree of novelty which comes out of a psychedelic experience as well, which could also contribute towards reducing depression as well. So as yet, those various kind of brain mechanisms haven't been directly explored in a prospective way, but are beginning to be explored. What we do know is that on paper, they tend to reduce depression fairly effectively, better than anything else that we currently have in the preliminary research studies.
So in a nutshell, the way they work is by disrupting that negative loop of my life is screwed, my life is blah, blah, blah. So they interrupt the loop.
Yes, they do interrupt the loop, but that may not be the only mechanism. There may be psychological factors as well. For instance, the people who have a full-blown mystical experience tend to have better clinical outcomes as well. So, there may be an underlying biological mechanism for those mystical experiences, but those people who go, oh, well, I met God, or I am God, or whatever it is, they're the ones who have better outcomes. They're the ones that are less likely to have depression, or less likely to have addiction remission, fall back into addiction, or they're the ones who, if they have end-of-life cancer, are less likely to have, fear of death, and so on and so forth. So it's something about that, oh, wow, experience, which has clinical implications, as well as perhaps some of the underlying psychobiological effects as well.
That's like people who try to commit suicide, have a near-death experience, come back, and they're like, oh no, I'm happy now.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a kind of huge degree of overlap between the near-death experiences and the psychedelic experiences people have, and these kind of profound ones. And they are life-changing events, and very fortunate for people who are perhaps suicidal and have those life-changing near-death experiences. Yeah, And I think there's certainly a lot to explore in the nature of the near-death experience as a kind of a spontaneous mystical experience, and how it relates to psychedelic experiences, which are kind of, attempted induced mystical experiences. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I think there's a lot of mileage to be explored in that, in terms of how they can be used to better people's mental health.
Is DMT the same as ayahuasca?
Not exactly, but ayahuasca contains DMT, and it's thought to be the primary psychoactive component of ayahuasca. So ayahuasca, in a way, is like an oral DMT. So DMT doesn't work orally, but if you mix a plant containing DMT with a plant containing MAOIs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which stops the enzyme in your stomach from breaking down the DMT can get to the brain. But the MAO inhibitors in themselves are also psychoactive. But it's thought that the primary kind of experience derived from ayahuasca is through the DMT. It's like it's the main thrust of the experience.
And what's the difference between that and LSD or magic mushrooms that people call shrooms? What's used clinically most often?
LSD belongs to the same category as chemical category as DMT. It's a tryptamine family, which means serotonin is also a tryptamine family. So it seems to primarily work on the serotonergic system. LSD is much more of a complex molecule, though, and it's semi-synthetic in that it's derived from nature, but it's given a few kind of chemical twists and turns. Whereas psilocybin is actually a kind of DMT. So psilocybin converts to psilocin in the body, and psilocin is 4-hydroxydimethyltryptamine, DMT. So it's a type of DMT, basically. It's in the DMT family. And DMT occurs widely in nature. It's in humans, it's in mammals, it's in many, many plants and other species. But it doesn't occur in fungus. Fungus has its own version, which is psilocybin and psilocin. So it's the fungus version of DMT, basically, in nature. And it's very similar in terms of the experience you have. But psilocybin, unlike DMT, is already active, so you can eat mushrooms straight away. If you were to kind of chew on chacruna, which contains DMT, you could eat it all day long, and you're not going to have a trip unless you mix it with some other plants to activate the DMT. Whereas mushrooms are kind of like an orally active DMT in a way, so they're very, very similar.
So, but your research has mostly been with ayahuasca?
No, various really, all sorts. LSD, ayahuasca, peyote, San Pedro, mescaline, and psilocybin. Always across the board, actually, and also some other more obscure substances as well. But most of my experimental work has looked at these classic psychedelics, really.
Mm-hmm. And what about, like, when I was young, people had stories about someone took LSD and then they spent the rest of their life thinking they were an orange. So how do you prevent from really disorganizing the whole system in a pretty permanent way?
Yeah, so those anecdotes which we hear, they're obviously kind of back in the 60s and the media hysteria around psychedelics. They're the ones that were kind of focused in on, and I think a lot of those kind of some of those experiences may have extended out of bad trips or negative psychological experiences under psychedelics, and maybe not having the right circumstance to integrate the experiences. Now that we're a bit more educated and it's 50, 60 years down the line, longer, 75 with LSD, we know a little bit more about the substances, and we can reduce the number of bad trips or difficult psychological experiences through paying attention to set and setting. So I think people are probably becoming better educated and not having so many of those bad trips. We're also better educated in how to integrate psychedelic experiences as well. So I think that can alleviate some of those acute kind of psychotic reactions. In terms of the long-term psychotic reactions, now, it used to be said back in the 60s, if you've taken LSD 3 times, you are by definition clinically insane. Now, we don't really think that anymore. And some recent research did these huge epidemiological surveys in the States. They had 130,000 people in 2 separate surveys, and they both found the same thing. And that is that all drugs tend to be related to mental health, poor mental health outcomes. So people who have taken recreational drugs tend to have worse mental health, apart from psychedelics. Okay, people who have taken psychedelics didn't have any worse mental health conditions than the general population, and in fact, and by some of the measures, they had better mental health. So people who had taken psilocybin were less likely to have psychiatric medication in the last year or been a psychiatric inpatient. Now, we don't know if that's demographic variables. We don't know if there's not necessarily cause and effect. But what we can say is that if psychedelics induced psychosis to any large extent, then we would see epidemiological signals of that. We don't see epidemics of people having gone mad because of taking psychedelics. There's just no relationship there. In fact, we find the opposite effect. So across the whole population, there's no tendency for people to have poor mental health outcomes because of taking psychedelics. However, we do know that there are people who've, tripped once and spent the rest of their life thinking they were an orange. So we generally tend to, myself and my colleagues, understand that there are some people who perhaps have a proclivity to develop psychosis. They may have genetic predisposition, and in which case, they may take a psychedelic and it may trigger a underlying psychotic predisposition. But we don't find population studies typically supporting the idea that, you're at greater risk of developing psychosis if you take psychedelics. So that's how we kind of understand it. But of course, you're going to get individual cases of people who do end up in long-term psychiatric care following a psychedelic experience, but they may have ended up there anyway.
You did a study with LSD produced synesthesia-like experiences, and that's, as I understand it, where I hear the note E and I associate it with, I see blue or something. Is that how you define it?
Yeah, so it's usually the stimulation of one sense experience has a concomitant or concurrent experience in a different sense modality. So we find this is a congenital condition in about maybe 2 or 3% of the population. Some people naturally have synesthesia, and they're usually quite specific, though. The most common type is like graphemes, like numbers and letters or days of the week have colours associated with them. That's one of the most common types. But there are some more exotic flavours, and there's probably almost as many flavours of synesthesia as there are combinations of different sense modalities. So we did some research. It's one of those things that gets quoted a lot in the psychedelic literature of people having synesthesia on psychedelics, but there was very little research on it. So myself and a colleague, Devon, and some other people, we surveyed the literature first of all. We did a huge survey of people who had taken drugs and also synesthetes, people who had synesthesia, about their experiences. And we found that, certain drugs, particularly psychedelics, had a proclivity to induce synesthesia-like experiences. So I think the number one drug was LSD. 58% of people who had taken LSD had an experience of synesthesia.
But
and the other trips,
only when they were tripping.
Exactly, yeah. These are people who didn't have synesthesia normally, and then they had synesthesia with psych. So occasionally you get it with meditation and hypnosis and a few other altered states, but not very often. Psychedelics seem to, fairly reliably, with LSD, more than half the people who've taken LSD had synesthesia, and slightly less, but similar figures for other tryptamines, so ayahuasca and psilocybin as well. And the most common variety was seeing sounds. So people would typically, what they would hear would have a kind of visual analog to it as well. Usually geometric patterns, very colourful, and they would be dynamic. So if you're listening to music, you would get these kind of beautiful geometric light patterns which would move and change form with the music.
Have you ever experienced that? That sounds like fun.
Oh yes, indeed. Yeah, no, it is. I'm lucky to have had those experiences.
Okay.
It's very nice. Yeah, and sometimes it can get more complex than that as well. So you're not only seeing the music, but you can taste it, you can feel it, and it's like your whole body is the music.
Wow.
You feel like all the molecules and atoms in your body are resonating with what you can hear.
That's that idea of getting rid of barriers and filtering.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you kind of tend to kind of dissolves your subject-object divide when you just become sound. It's extremely beautiful experience as well.
Oh, wow. There's a new word that I came across in your work of psychodelimancy, controlled experiments in psychedelic precognition, and seeing discarnate entities with DMT. What is that all about?
Okay, so the psychedelimancy is the mantic arts, of which there are many, like cartomancy, like tarot cards. So using a system to divine the future. I can't think of all the others. Bibliomancy, using a book to divine the future, to get an answer to a question of something in the future. And so psychedelimancy is research on the use of psychedelics for precognitive experiences. And there's a lot of anecdotal accounts of this in the literature, certainly from, some of the earliest explorers and discoverers of psychedelics, but there's been very little experimental research. So I've been conducting some of the first precognition experiments under the influence of psychedelics.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, so they're quite abstract. So they follow the lines of classic parapsychology research techniques. So I've adapted one which is similar to a kind of dream precognition or dream or Gansfeld technique, whereby the person is in an altered state and they try and visualize the target. They don't know what the target is, other than it may be a 1-minute video clip. They get their visualization, it's kind of written down, whatever it is, the content of it, and then they receive 4 1-minute video clips, which are as different from each other as possible. And one of those is the target, but nobody knows what the target is because it hasn't even been selected yet. That comes later. And so they then compare their visual imagery with their intention of finding the target with those 4 video clips, and they rank them. They give them a confidence rating to each of the 4, and so they can identify which one they think is the target. And then once that stage is done, you run a random number generator which selects the target. So it's completely independent. There's no way you can second guess what a random number generator is going to do. You can't use inference. So it's a secure test paradigm, somewhat abstract, obviously, and by chance alone you would expect to get it right 1 in 4, 25% of the time, because it's random. All other things being equal, a random number generator will, pick one clip 1 in 4 times. And so we do this. This is the task, and then we see whether or not the correspondence between the person's intentions and mentation differs from the clip, differs from what would be expected by chance. So I've ran several experiments so far. One was a self-experiment with mescaline, did 20 trials and got a significant result and some really nice hits. Then I ran a trial with 13 scientists on LSD, which was also significant, but weirdly in the opposite direction. So they rated the actual target the lowest,
Wow.
significantly.
Wow.
Which is more problematic, but it's still a very unexpected result. It's significant, and it was a very small. You would unlikely to get significant results, with this smaller sample size.
Do you think it was this they were wanted to prove it wrong or something, that their intent was, I'm a skeptic, I'm not going to get this right?
Maybe not consciously, but it's interesting. The vast majority of them, all but one or two of them, were very skeptical. They were kind of, very much materialist scientists. So it wasn't really in their belief system. So curiously, collectively, they somehow did the opposite. And
that makes
thereby,
sense. Because their intention was to prove it wrong, and they did.
Exactly. Yeah, there you go.
But in an improbable way, so they did prove it.
Exactly. So it's an interesting finding.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I really like that one. I'm sure my critics will have something to say about that, but it's a significant result nonetheless. So I'm now replicating that again with people not scientists, because I think they're bad test subjects, but with DMT, to see how that works. But there hasn't been much of this research done, so it's very slow going and in the very early stages.
Wow.
Interesting number.
Then you've done work in ethnography, and you wrote about talking with the spirits. I'm assuming that's like shamans, and oftentimes the shamans will use like mushrooms or something. What have you found about how they do their journeying?
Yeah, I spent some amount of time working with various shamans and more kind of ethnography really, and participant observation and so on. And of course, as Stan Krippner, you probably know, he has this great little mnemonic about shamans and altered states, is that they go into an altered state at will in the name of their community to transcend time and space and bring back useful information from those realms. And they do it, go into those altered states, perhaps through drumming or diet or dancing or dreaming or with drugs. And drugs is probably one of the least common methods. But there are tribes all over the world in every continent that have made use of psychoactive plants and occasionally animals as well. And they're the ones I'm primarily interested in. But it's quite a serious undertaking. There's often many, many years of training. There's usually a calling to the job in the first place. People may have visionary experiences. They may have got very ill themselves to the point of nearly dying and recovered, and had a calling to do it, and then they'd undergo very prolonged and intensive and very challenging training. So, for instance, classically, ayahuasqueros in South America would spend 2 years dieting and eating nothing but plantains, bananas, dried fish, and drinking ayahuasca, and then taking bark off various trees. They may eat the same tree bark for a month to understand these doctor trees. The Waradica, the Huicholis who make use of peyote, their kind of training is minimum 12 years, at which point you become like a master. They talk about it in kind of university tradition, somewhat jokingly. It's like, oh yeah, he's just got his masters, and oh yeah, this is the doctor, and oh, this is the professor. You've got this kind of stately elder shaman. And they really do have very intensive long-term training. So it's not something that can be accomplished very quickly or easily. People in the West talk about, having shamanic experiences, and we can all have shamanic experiences, but it's not the same thing as being a shaman, which is a huge undertaking, and a great burden, because they exist in this kind of space between the worlds, often a great personal sacrifice, and and one of their roles is the healing of the planet itself. They're the caretakers of their own environment, of their communities. They're go-betweens between the spirits of nature and the human world, and they have responsibilities to all of those. So they really are the kind of ontological middlemen and women between the worlds, and it's typically a lifelong job and a great commitment.
A lot of us read Carlos Castaneda's accounts of working with Don Juan. How accurate do you think that was, or how fictional?
Well, there's a lot of debate over Carlos Castaneda's teachings of Don Juan, obviously, and it's now thought by scholars that it's at least semi-fictional. There's some bits in the book which don't add up. But the essence of it is very real, if you know what I mean. It kind of the shamans I've spent time with, that's kind of how they exist, in this kind of magical reality. Whether or not teachings of Don Juan is genuinely real is interesting, because at about the same time that Castaneda was doing his PhD thesis, Michael Harner was kind of doing his as well, and he worked with one of the tribes in the Shuar, I think it was, in Peru and Ecuador, and his accounts are no less fantastical than the teachings of Don Juan, really, but his is thought to be bona fide anthropological research. It wasn't semi-fictional. He didn't have this kind of mysterious cult and all the rest of it. Well, he set up his own shamanic school, but and there are various accounts, well attested to, of anthropologists going native and having extraordinary experiences. Increasingly, it was a big taboo, of course, until Michael Harner and Castaneda came along, and they pretty much split the world of anthropology in half, particularly Castaneda. And out of that, the anthropology of consciousness as a subdiscipline was born, and with the adherence of Castaneda, people who believed that these extraordinary phenomena shouldn't necessarily just be explained away. That it was the ultimate ethnocentrism just to explain these things as kind of primitive thinking and all the rest of it, and to kind of seriously consider them on their own terms. So whether or not Castaneda is fictional or not, the essence of the book is true to the shamanic experience and tradition.
How good is your Spanish, and how did you make contact with those people, those tribes in Mexico?
Yeah, my Spanish is pretty bad. I mean, I've been visiting Mexico now for 20 years. I get by. It's not brilliant. And it took me a long time to actually, connect with some of the indigenous tribes there. So I've only been working with the Waradica for about the last 6 years, largely on account of the fact that they began to open up more to foreigners as well, on account of their sacred lands were just about to be surface mined for minerals, and they were going to lose their sacred cosmological topography, to open cast mining. So they became much more interested in foreigners coming to visit them as well. So I was lucky to kind of coincide with that turning point, and my Spanish had got to a kind of a passable enough degree at that point. But they, a lot of them don't even speak Spanish actually, although most of them are pretty good Spanish speakers. And fortunately, they've got a translator that hangs out with them who speaks at least 5 languages, and we're really good friends. So, yeah, often somewhat brokenly, but we get by.
Right. And were they resistant to you at first, or they thought you could help preserve the land?
Well, they were very welcoming. I think some of them were a bit more resistant and suspicious, and It's been a kind of issue of divide in their communities about how much they interact with outsiders. But they'd all started getting the same message, like from the fire. They say the fire tells them everything they need to know.
Oh.
It was pretty clear as well, I guess, that if they didn't start opening up to outsiders because they really needed some external help, they were very much in danger of losing their sacred lands and where the peyote grows, and their, which is basically at the core of their culture. Their entire culture is based around the use of peyote. And so it had been the end of their culture, of their medicine, of them as a cultural entity. And they were lucky enough to get a lot of outside help, in that they managed to get a high court injunction against the mining, which is still in this kind of dormant stage.
And it's not just the shamans who use peyote, it's like part of an initiation ritual for youth or something?
Exactly. The whole community takes peyote. The children start taking it from about the age of 5.
Wow.
And then they'll keep on taking it to their 95 or 105.
Wow.
Particularly if they've trained to be a shaman. And actually, shamans are very common in their community. It's not like maybe a lot of your more kind of traditional shamanic cultures where there'll be one person in the village who'll live at the edge of the village will be the shaman.
Right.
It's really at the core of their whole existence. They're like, think of it more like, like a parallel to Tibetan Buddhism, like how one child in every family will be a Buddhist monk, like pretty much there's somebody in every family who is a shaman. I'd say maybe like 20% of them are shamans. So, it's like they're one of their main occupations. They're all subsistence farmers, and they make artwork. They're the kind of the 3 things they do, so...
Do the shamans think that we're going to make it as a species, or what are their prophecies for how we're going to do?
I think they're pretty terrified. I think that's also part of why they're opening up. It's like, I guess for a long time their attitude was, well, we're just going to sit this whole thing out. We're just going to sit up here in the top of our mountains and carry on with our existence and keep things pure. And, when all the crazy foreigners have destroyed everything and realized they can't eat money, they'll be knocking on our door. But I think they realize that, yeah, it's time now. And I think you find this with indigenous cultures the world over, that they are very willing suddenly to share their wisdom with foreigners, with outsiders, because I think they realize that the time is not for kind of hiding away anymore, that we really are in a kind of crisis point ecologically, and that the rest of the world really need to kind of make use of their traditions and the wisdom that they have, and their values and their ways of being and connecting with nature.
Are you going to write a book about that?
Sorry?
Are you going to write a book about that?
Oh, maybe, yeah. Yeah, I think I better have.
Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully the next one's going to be more of a personal kind of journey, and it's going to involve a lot more of that kind of stuff. Yeah, for sure.
How are you doing on time? I know we've been sitting for a while, and are you getting hungry? Are you okay? I have a lot more questions.
You must be psychic. My wife just appeared at the door going, do you want to eat some dinner? Literally like 30 seconds ago.
Yeah, we can continue later if you like.
Yeah, sure. How much more do you have to get through? Okay, let's do that, shall we?
So where else have you worked with indigenous people besides Mexico?
Mostly in Mexico, actually, but I've done some kind of field trips to Madagascar, Brazil, Ecuador, and also India as well. So some of that's been researching shamanism, and some of it researching mediumship, transpossession, and the like.
Wow.
So
where in India?
Down in mostly along the west coast. So kind of Kerala, Karnataka, around that way, and then some time up in further north, kind of Rishikesh, and over in Bihar as well.
And did you find that that the mediums were accurate, and did it seem like they were communicating with disincarnate entities, or what were you convinced of their abilities?
I think, I mean, kind of not having time for like deep ethnographic research in those locations, I couldn't really comment too much on the accuracy. I mean, a lot of it would be like, from what I could gather, there were fairly kind of like life advice kind of stuff, you know. But I couldn't say about the kind of stunning accuracy of any of the accounts. I've never actually had such a kind of deep exploration of indigenous practices of mediumship that it's revealed anything astonishing. I mean, there's often a large cultural divide. For instance, in Madagascar, you know, the medium there, Trombo, and she went into trance, and she was talking about my ancestors who were crocodiles, and well, you know, so it doesn't necessarily always translate because they have a very different cosmology. I mean, that's going way back. I can't really verify that kind of thing.
Oh, that's the funniest thing I've ever heard of.
Which is probably right, you know, but it's a bit out of the kind of scope of my research.
Oh, that's great. So, as a psychologist, some psychologists say, well, these kind of altered states and psi phenomena are just the results of schizoapathy or hallucinations or psychosis, or it's a disturbed brain. What's your take on the physiology, the psychology of extraordinary experiences?
Yeah, I think I mean, historically, it's been an easy way of explaining them away. You know, oh, it's just delusion, or it's just hallucination. It's a classic. It's kind of like a wastebasket kind of umbrella term for things we don't understand. So, you know, anything in an altered state of consciousness is just kind of consigned to a kind of defective category immediately, which is unfair and unkind, and glosses over far more than it actually illuminates. So I think it's incumbent upon us as psychologists, if we really want to understand the full range of human experience and not just kind of cut ourselves off to a kind of limited scope, we really need to kind of catalogue and identify and categorize and classify all the different altered states and the phenomena, the experiences within them, which is kind of part of my task. I mean, many other people have already been doing this, but you know, one of the things I'm doing is using the same measures across different altered states of consciousness, which hasn't really been done before. So looking at psychedelic experiences, dark room, anechoic chambers, breath work, flotation tanks, and all this kind of thing, and just using the same kind of measures. So we get some commonality across them and look at the kind of preponderance of certain kinds of experiences and so on. And then we can start to understand the underlying neurobiological mechanisms too. But yeah, it's been hugely convenient. I think, is it Charles Laughlin, who's a kind of anthropologist / neuroscientist, he talks about the Western cultures being monophasic cultures, in that we only really value the ordinary, everyday, waking state of consciousness, you know, and anything else is kind of demonized, you know, or considered delusionary or whatever. Whereas many other cultures are what you call polyphasic, you know, they value altered states of consciousness as sources of important information, you know, as much as, and sometimes even more than, the ordinary waking state of consciousness. And you can think of all the Eastern traditions or shamanic cultures and so on and so forth, you know, that they value their dreams. Or the Shuar, for instance, they get up in the middle of the night and share their dreams as a family, and they'll base all the important decisions for the rest of the day on somebody's, if somebody has a particularly kind of auspicious dream, it could be a child or an elder. It doesn't matter. It's completely democratic. They'll use that dream to inform their choices for the day. So we're very much a polyphasic culture, and to our loss, I think, because there's so much more we can garner and understand by looking at the full scope of human experience.
Do you think that goes along with being patriarchal and valuing left brain over whole brain, and that they kind of go together?
Yeah, partly. I mean, I think the antecedents of this are very old. I mean, it probably started with the patriarchy a couple of thousand years ago, and continued with monotheism. And then out of that became the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. Which continued on in that strain. I mean, I think we wouldn't have had the scientific revolution if it wasn't for monotheism. And they both treated the other in the same kind of way. It was demonized literally under Christianity and other faiths, and then science kind of did the job of despiriting it and labeling it psychosis. But the other altered states, dreams, all of those kind of things until Freud, really, at least he kind of engaged with dreams and brought them back into the conversation. But he had no time for exceptional experiences, and it was Jung that really picked up the baton there and carried on with it. But so traditionally, we're fighting a kind of long tradition of demonizing experiences, exceptional experiences, either literally with demons.
Witches were usually women, so they kind of, that kind of goes along the fear of the feminine, the fear of the irrational or unknown.
Yeah, absolutely, and that is one of the reasons why we don't have these interests in the occult or in altered states or psychedelics in Europe, in Euro-America, because of the legacy of the Inquisition, and then what continued afterwards with the scientific kind of Inquisition, if you like. Like parapsychology as a subject matter is still just kind of outcast. For no real good reason other than kind of intellectual prejudice, really. It's like there's a few very vocal gatekeepers within the academy who do a kind of concerted job of just ridiculing it and rejecting it a priori. It's like, oh, well, this is obviously bonkers because it can't possibly work. It's like psi just isn't possible. Therefore, the research findings must be fraudulent or flawed. It's starting off as that as your basic premise, which is counter to everything that science should stand for. Science should be open-minded and skeptical in the true sense of the word, and that is it's openly critical of everything, even its own belief systems and its own prejudices. But it's become somewhat ossified and dogmatic. So the tradition continues.
You could say the same thing about quantum physics. I mean, physicists, the quantum mechanics founders said it's weird, and Einstein said spooky action at a distance. So a lot of quantum physics isn't believable either. I don't believe that you're 90% empty. You look solid to me, but I know that you're mostly empty.
I feel it sometimes. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's extraordinary, actually, because, the biggest critics of parapsychology are usually psychologists, and everyone defers to them, or they know this is all rubbish. And yet, if you look at what's happening in physics, right, obviously those skeptics in psychology aren't really up with what's going on in the world of physics, because, physics makes parapsychology look like a tea party. It's so astonishingly strange. Spooky action at a distance, non-locality, multiple worlds, 11 or 13 dimensions of space-time. It's astonishingly strange. The kind of time symmetry, the time goes forwards and backwards. I mean, why is parapsychology so kind of feared and outlandish conceptually. Then, if the what's going on in physics makes it look quite tame.
Well, they use that word woo-woo. And somehow, if you say, oh, it's woo-woo, then that means I don't even have to look at the research. I wonder what's going on, what kind of personal fears generate that lack of rationality. I mean, are they afraid of discovering their own non-logical part of their psyche?
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, certainly with like anomalistic psychology is the branch of psychology which looks at parapsychological phenomena but from a mainstream perspective, i.e. a materialist reductionist perspective, and assumes at the beginning that there is no paranormal. Everything's kind of easily explained by current scientific understanding. And it's like they only ever look for the cognitive deficits, so like people only believe in parapsychological phenomena because they have some kind of faulty cognitions, or they're self-deluding themselves, or they have kind of memory or perceptual deficits, or they're very bad at kind of making logical reasoning or probabilistic judgments and so on and so forth. By inference, then, they're saying, and I don't believe in any of this stuff, therefore I'm logical, clever, smart. I mean, they use these terminologies that people who believe in the paranormal are either stupid, mad, or a bit deluded, right? There's something wrong with them, and I don't believe in it. Therefore, I'm smart and clever and bright and really sane and logical. It's there. So they haven't managed to separate themselves out from their research subject matter, and there is a kind of inherent arrogance embedded within it, I think. For instance, they never bother to look at the positive correlates of paranormal belief. They just look at the negative correlates, for instance, like heightened empathy. People who tend to have paranormal beliefs seem to be more empathic, for instance. So there's many other factors to look at. And I think it's inherently kind of smug, really, in its own way. It has this kind of inbuilt kind of like, I'm not stupid kind of. So I think it's a fear of like, I think people they just they have something to prove,
It seems to me that a fair amount of maybe more male academics than female were nerds in secondary school, so they weren't popular, they weren't the jocks, and so they are like proving themselves. Well, I'm Dr. So-and-so, and I know all this stuff, so I'm not a wimpy nerd anymore.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these kind of people doing this research are my friends and colleagues, so I have to be careful what I say, but I think there's a certain amount of like self-grandeur and like ridicule towards the others. It's not treated fairly. There's a recent paper which, it's just so self-sanctimonious and congratulatory. It's like, oh, look at these people. They're so stupid. They believe in this kind of thing. It verges on ridicule, and sometimes it is just out and out ridicule. Which is, you wouldn't get away with that in mental health research, right? That's like
I'm not psychotic. Yay.
Like, oh, they're all, they're all crazy nuts, bonkers, lunatics. It's like, it's not really a done thing. But somehow, the left field is fair game for ridicule.
What?
To be fair, I think there is a lot of stuff in the New Age which lacks kind of credulity. So yeah.
Yeah, like it's tempting for me to say, oh, we can explain into clairvoyance and healing from a distance by quantum non-locality, but physicists say, oh no, you can't do that. We don't know what causes that kind of communication between entangled particles. We don't know what that information exchange is, so you can't use quantum physics to explain psi.
Yeah, that's fair enough to a point. I think what it does is it opens up the possibility, though, of an explanation down the line. I mean, at the moment, nobody really understands quantum physics, and so using it to explain psi isn't really satisfactory either. You're trying to explain one unknown with another unknown. But the very fact that we have this phenomena, which is fairly well accepted but badly understood within physics, then it opens up the possibility for long local communication on the level of the organism. And also things like time symmetry in physics as well. That time goes backwards as well as forwards in all the quadratic equations, and we just disregard those solutions where time goes backwards because that's not in accord with our everyday experience. And yet precognition and presentiment would seem to be evidence for that, even though it is somewhat subtle and largely unconscious. There does seem to be those kind of anomalies whereby information transfer goes backwards in time. Mm-hmm. So, I think there is a danger, of course, of borrowing concepts and poorly understood theories from physics and applying them to parapsychology. But there are some physicists working in our field. So it's an ennoble endeavor on one hand, but also somewhat kind of precarious on the other, because we don't really know what the limitations and implications are of quantum physics.
Who are those physicists that you're thinking of?
Okay, well, there's Peter Bansal or Dick Bierman, Ed May in particular. So there are numerous, Bernard Carr, Peter Josephson,
Brian Josephson.
Sorry, Brian Joseph. I do take my apologies. Brian Josephson. These aren't lightweight academics either. Josephson's got a Nobel Prize, and he's very seriously contemplating the nature of extended mind and how that can be incorporated into physical theories. So it's an interesting field to be in, because it's primarily populated by psychologists and physicists who are kind of two different ends of the spectrum, but looking at phenomena which seems to, as yet and in unknown ways, combines the principles of both. So it's the kind of leading edge of the mind-body problem in a way, because you've got this one field which looks purely at the physical, and the other is very much concerned with the consciousness and the psyche, and there needs to be some kind of overlap or meeting ground between the two. But I think when we understand, I don't know which way around it goes, the chicken and the egg. Maybe if we understand the nature of psi and we come up with a good theory that combines physics and psychology, we may understand the hard problem of consciousness, or vice versa. We may understand psi when we understand the mind-body problem. But it may be that psi is part of the solution to the mind-body problem. And certainly any explanation, any theory of the mind-body interaction needs to incorporate psi, or you're excluding a large kind of section of the data.
The hard problem of consciousness is we don't know if consciousness or matter came first?
Not really. It's more to do with what is the nature of mind and what is the nature of body, and how do consciousness and the material world interact? What is the nature? And there's some of the monist materialists would say everything's just physical and consciousness is an illusion. And then your idealist on the other end would say, well, everything's just consciousness and the material world's an illusion. And then you got everything in between. Like a strict dualist would say, there's mind and there's body, and these two are separate, but they somehow interact. And then you've got various emanations of that, and nobody has a completely satisfactory explanation of how mind and matter interact. It's been a kind of conundrum for a couple of thousand years at the very least. We don't seem to be any closer to cracking it.
What about you? Do you lean more towards the consciousness was first way of looking at it?
Oh, in terms of, I think there's a lot to be said for the primacy of consciousness. It certainly can't be disregarded as any less important than the physical. Um, just from the very fact that our whole experience of the world is our consciousness. Empiricism, is the study of the world through our empirical senses. So everything is experience ultimately. Descartes was right in that respect. But I think that we can't disregard either of them. And if you try and disregard the material world, try being a solipsist idealist and stepping out in front of a bus. You're going to have a very physical experience that will kind of put a new light on that belief system very quickly. So, and yet they're seemingly somehow incompatible. So it's a conundrum. I don't pretend to even have a hint of an idea of how to kind of rationalize or make these two seemingly disparate things compatible. And I'll leave that to kind of brighter minds than me to solve the puzzle. But I just know that our current explanations are inadequate. So I remain open-minded and agnostic.
Yeah, because like Indian yogis, like in Yogananda's autobiography, Yogi, he describes the guru being two places at once. And they see him at the same time, two places at once. So that the belief was that he could teleport himself. So I think that kind of phenomenon happens a fair amount in Indian mysticism and other. The shamans do that too, right? They can appear at different places.
Yeah, it's true. I've had an experience of that. Yeah, it's quite interesting. Padre Pio was another one, a kind of Catholic priest who rather upset the Vatican because he kept performing miracles like levitating and things like that. So they kept moving him to different churches, but his congregation would kind of keep seeing him even though he was hundreds of miles away in another church, which is rather annoying. So, I mean, it's hard to kind of, that's some pretty far out phenomena, and we don't have any kind of good documented evidence of it, other than lots of reports. But it shouldn't just be kind of excluded out of hand because of that. So there's a lot we don't understand. Sorry?
Did you see a shaman levitate or transport?
Well, I can't be 100% certain he wasn't where he said he was, but no, because he did disappear. Or that I wasn't hallucinating, but I wasn't the only one. So we were doing a ceremony, and the shaman took himself off to bed and left us to it. And he says, "I'll keep an eye on you. You kind of just carry on." And he kept on appearing throughout the night to people. We kept seeing him just kind of standing there looking over us, and then you'd look, and then it disappeared, and he was tucked off in bed in his hut, as far as we could tell, for the rest of the night. So yeah, but I don't think he was actually physically there, and I'm not entirely sure it wasn't just some kind of hallucination. But I'm open to the possibility that my consciousness perceived him there, and in his mind, he was also there. He was also kind of there, looking over us as he said he was, in his dreams. So, but that's very much in the realm of consciousness, I think, rather than the physical world. I wouldn't expect to go up to him and be able to kind of take a hair sample or something from him, or take something out of hand.
What that implies is that we have an astral body, and that when people see ghosts, they really are seeing some kind of energy system from someone who formerly had a physical body. I mean, those kind of reports have been around for ages.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know the energy, the evidence for any kind of actual energy. You could probably look to poltergeist phenomena to some extent, but it's not certain what that is. What I do know is that, or I think the kind of simplest kind of explanation that you could boil it all down to, these are experiences of consciousness, So when people talk about seeing ghosts or getting abducted by aliens, I don't necessarily think the ghosts are physical or there really are kind of aliens in UFOs, but the people are having these experiences, and they may on some level be genuine, but their experiences not in the physical realm. So I don't think necessarily the laws of physics apply there, or that notions of energy are necessarily required to fulfill a kind of rudimentary explanation. But it's very much in the realm of consciousness.
Well, Mac at Harvard did the studies of people who are abducted, and I think sometimes they have like implants or something that you can see an effect on their physical body of what the aliens were doing experimenting. So that's pretty physical. That's not just consciousness.
Yeah, true. But the nature of consciousness is that it can be so powerful. So hypnosis, for instance, tells us that we can affect our bodies in extraordinary ways through our minds. You could, if people are highly suggestible, you can pretend to put a cigarette out on their skin and their skin will blister, but there was no heat applied whatsoever. So it's just the power of suggestion can make your skin blister. Then there's we don't know the limits of what our minds can make our bodies do. People having all kinds of extraordinary recoveries from terminal illnesses and things like that. So the limits of the mind over one's body are well unknown as well. So again, I don't have any certainty that physical evidence on someone's body of an abduction is necessarily irrefutable either.
Got it. To me, the most interesting people to study would be people with dissociative identity disorder, and you know how one alter can have a disease and the other doesn't have it. That would be so interesting. Has anybody studied their physiology when they change alter to alter, and their whole body or their vision or whatever changes?
Not that I'm aware. I haven't done too much research into dissociative identity disorder. There's a great book by the Kellys from I can't remember the name of it now. And they explore kind of extraordinary phenomena like that in some detail. I'll get you the name of the book, but it's not my area particularly, although I am intrigued by those kind of phenomena. Yeah, I mean, that is really interesting, and I kind of in the same kind of category of people having like heart transplants or organ transplants and adopting parts of the personality. No, I don't know how solid that evidence is either, but there's some extraordinary phenomena there which throws up a lot of questions, more questions than it answers, really.
And so, as you say, the logical conclusion would be, I'm going to explore and research it, not dismiss it.
Absolutely. And I think that's, it's a shame that a lot of this work has been marginalized over the years, but I think it's coming back into its own. The recent kind of excitement in neuroscience, is 20 years ago, consciousness research was kind of unheard of, apart from a handful of kind of far out researchers, and now it's a huge kind of portion of academic interest. So, and I think you cannot ignore all of this extraordinary phenomena, and a lot of kind of mainstream neuroscience is now beginning to look at these kind of phenomena as well. Perhaps not as open-mindedly as they should, because they automatically assume there's kind of brain-based explanations for everything, which is a kind of limiting starting point, I think. But I think it's receiving a lot more attention now, exceptional experiences, which is great. The genie's out of the bottle. Same with psychedelic research as well. After a 50-year hiatus, it's now a hot-button topic. And, research with psychedelics and brain imaging is some of the most attracted some of the most media attention and some of the most cited research we've had in the last few years. It's a kind of huge news in science, right? So it's getting a lot of attention.
Could you say a word about schizy? How do you say it? The people.
Schizotypy. Sorry, I call it schizotypy.
Schizotypy. But
People,
they're not psychotic. They just have unordinary sensitivity or awareness.
yeah, so or psychotypy or schizotypy. Sorry. So it's a continuum. It's like a personality construct. There's schizotypal personality disorder and there's schizophrenia. They're very different things. They're kind of psychiatric diagnoses. Whereas schizotypy, as I pronounce it, is a personality construct, which is, you can say plot at how much somebody has, how schizotypal somebody is in a normal population. And it's used as a predictor of people who are thought to develop schizophrenia. So it's usually like 4 different constructs, one of which is kind of unusual experiences or magical beliefs, or both. And so people who score high in that are thought to be more likely to develop schizophrenia, but only if they have all the other symptoms as well. There's introverted anhedonia and cognitive disorganization. But you do get a subsection of people who are high on schizotypy, largely just because they have a lot of unusual experiences, but they're otherwise normally functioning individuals, and they're called benign or positive schizotypy. So it's kind of viewed in a psychopathological way, but you can have healthy schizotypy, so those are those people, yes, who are probably more prone to having anomalous experiences or exceptional experiences. There's other kind of measures as well, like Michael Thalborn developed this thing called transliminality, which is which taps into those unusual experiences as well. Other people have put forward the anomaly-prone personality type, or you could think of what other kind of fantasy proneness has some kind of commonalities with it as well. So the various kind of personality measures which people use to try and identify people who are more likely to have these kind of unusual experiences or exceptional experiences. But it doesn't necessarily mean they are psychopathological. And in fact, in the general population, paranormal beliefs tend not to be correlated with psychological dysfunction.
Because most people have had the experience of knowing, oh, so-and-so's on the phone, or so-and-so's staring at me, or I
Absolutely.
better not go that way.
Yeah, a lot of these experiences are very common. Like it's typically the majority of the population who report at least one kind of paranormal experience or belief. And in different cultures that varies. Brazil, it's like about 95% of the population hold some paranormal beliefs. And then you get very secular countries, like parts of Scandinavia, have very low beliefs in paranormal phenomena. So there's cultural differences too. But the link to psychopathology is limited. Obviously, the association is that people who have schizophrenia, if you'd like to, or diagnosed with schizophrenia, let's say, often have magical beliefs and delusions which include kind of paranormal-like phenomena like thought transference and so on. But just because that small subsection of people with the psychopathology happen to have these beliefs doesn't mean that the rest holds true across the general population.
But have you found that there's a correlation with people who have these kind of extraordinary experiences and do test fairly high on schizotypy, however you say it?
Yes, because they'll score high just by the very fact that one of the subscales of schizotypy is, we'll get there eventually, is the unusual belief. So if you've had extraordinary experiences, you would naturally score high on schizotypy. What we find is, though, experimentally in the Psy research is people who tend to believe in the paranormal are also the same people who tend to have had paranormal experiences, and they do much better overall on ESP tasks or Psy experiments. And that's fairly robust. It's one of the most robust findings from parapsychology in terms of personality variables. And meta-analysis recently, again, verified that. So people who have these experiences are more likely to do well in experiments testing it.
That's just common sense. If I've experienced it, I tend to believe it. If I believe it, then I tend to be open to doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. As much as seeing is believing, believing is seeing. No, uh, uh, yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the fundamentals of what we're discovering about the nature of psi. It's not so looking for a purely physical explanation of it is probably incomplete because there are a lot of psychological variables which seem to be related to it. So if you don't believe in it, you're less likely to have experiences of it, which is also a bit of a kind of circular loop. If you've never had an experience, you wouldn't believe in it. And because you don't believe in it, you're unlikely to have any experiences. So you can see how people who have never had experiences are never likely to remain very skeptical and therefore quite ridiculing of these experiences, perhaps throughout their entire life, until they kind of near towards the end of the mortal coil and they start getting a bit shifty and shaky about the nature of reality and what may lie beyond,
Their dead ancestors start appearing to them.
Yeah. I mean, those kind of experiences occur whether you're an atheist or not,
Let's see, you talk about, this is still under ethnography, rock art or Rorschach. Is there more in topics that meets the eye? What does that mean?
Oh, yeah. So it was a bit of research. I was looking into the nature of what are called entoptics, are these geometric patterns that people see in altered states of consciousness, especially with psychedelics, but not just. I talked about it a little bit with the synesthesia, where you see sounds, it's often geometric patterns. So these are very common in psychedelic experiences, but you also get them in hypnagogia, hypnosis, meditation, and so on. But they're less common. Even some people will see them just in dark rooms as well, quite quickly. And it was based on the research from, archaeology. In the world of archaeology, they tried to explain Upper Paleolithic rock art, like the oldest human art. It was lacking a kind of common theory. And they suggested that the earliest artists, these cave artists, would be in altered states of consciousness because there was a universality and a proclivity for these geometric patterns and motifs
like
to occur in rock art.
Spirals?
Sorry? Yeah, spirals and zigzags and crosshatches and so on. And so it's a pretty good theory. And they said, well, they're explaining rock art, but the people who put forward this theory were very much of this kind of reductionist viewpoint. They're saying, well, because these experiences are universal, they're kind of hardwired into the human brain. And I took a bit of an issue with that because it's just an assumption, really. There are some explanations, some theories which go along the lines that it's just if you apply kind of a mathematical algorithm to the kinds of patterns that your optic system is programmed to kind of respond to, you can get nice geometric patterns out of it, like an Etch-a-Sketch or something, which is a kind of very simplified way of considering it. But then if you look at the kinds of things that people actually report on DMT, for instance, people talk about seeing extra-dimensional geometric percepts, so like geometric patterns but with more than 3 dimensions, spatial dimensions, which I can't even imagine, let alone, explain. And that would seem to go beyond how we explain them in kind of neurobiological terms. How is it people can perceive higher spatial dimensions or geometric objects with more than 3 spatial dimensions? How do we explain that neurobiologically when, we have to make a few leaps and we can't even explain visual perception. There's like some miracle occurs in the explanation, How do we get from electrochemical signals to this? I can see you in front of me. It's like, where does that qualia occur? I don't perceive electrochemical impulses. I perceive this distribution of light, which corresponds to your physical presence, right? So just trying to point out to some of the anomalies of entoptic experiences that occur, and our a priori assumptions in our explanations of them.
Mm-hmm. You did a little bit of work about I hear dead people, where disincarnate entities supposedly talk on radio or tape recorders and that kind of thing.
Oh yeah, that was one of my research students did a project looking at kind of apophenia, like the tendency to pick up or perceive patterns in apparently random sounds or randomly random data. So we tried to develop some measures of apophenia, and we looked at these audio clips which were supposedly they were anomalous in origin, so that they may have been picked up on recorders not recording anything, for instance. So supposedly transcorporal communications, and so we looked at some genuine recordings, so-called genuine recordings that people had documented, and we tried making some kind of our own pseudo versions where we'd have kind of a lot of white noise in the background, and then kind of have very, very faint audio kind of messages in there, and then we just looked at pure white noise, and we looked at what kind of personalities were more likely to detect the sounds. And what we actually found was that, if I can remember, it was quite a complex bit of research and different findings, that people who tended to have more unusual experiences tended to genuinely detect them. So they were more likely to hear sounds in whatever medium you played them, but they were more likely to detect genuine sounds as much as they were pseudo sounds and so on. So there was some. I'd have to kind of dig out the results again to look at it, but it was a student project, and it was quite interesting. And as much as anything, we were trying to develop kind of measures of apophenia, people's tendency to find patterns.
There was some famous British guy who died and communicated very specific information that only he could have known. Do you remember who that was? I don't.
Might have been Oliver Lodge. There's been a few attempts, I think. Sir Oliver Lodge was a kind of Victorian scientist and spiritualist, and I think he attempted to send some transcommunications from beyond the grave, some kind of code, and there's a very lengthy bit of research into it. So it was kind of it would have to be a series of coded messages for them to unlock it to work, to kind of verify that it actually happened. And I can't remember the actual outcome of it. But it's been attempted a few times, but I'm not so clear on the literature. Somebody more versed in that quite dense literature could tell you more. But It has been attempted, yeah, certainly, on more than one occasion as well.
Yeah. All right, moving right along to local geomagnetic activity and the connection with Tibetan Buddhist psychic awareness. They call it, what are they, ley lines, and there's the interest in the magnetic patterns in the earth that influences you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was collaborating with two people, Serena Roney Dougal, who'd been doing a lot of research with Indian yogis and Tibetan Buddhist lamas and Rinpoches. She spent 7 years out in India in ashrams and monasteries doing clairvoyance and precognition experiments with the yogis and lamas and Rinpoches. And but way back when in the 80s, she was looking at various theories, like looking at electromagnetic field fluctuations, geomagnetic field fluctuations, electromagnetic sensitivity in people. And that kind of led her to look at biomagnetite in the human brain, in the pineal gland, and then also explore the possible production of DMT in the human pineal gland, and put all those things together. So she was trying to look at, the whole scope of it. So so the project was, so she'd moved back to the UK and was doing research in a Tibetan Buddhist monastery in Scotland, which happened to be very like a mile away from one of only 2 or 3 super sensitive magnetometers in the country. Looked at geomagnetic field fluctuations, and so we were able to collect the data over a period of a few years. And we're also trying to timing it to look at a longitudinal study over the range of solar activity. So the geomagnetic field, Earth's magnetic field, fluctuates. It fluctuates on various seasonally, but also so it's linked to solar activity as well, and also kind of sidereal activity, other activity in the cosmos, and then its own activity as well. But some of the kind of clear periodicities are linked to the solar sunspot cycles, which over go full cycle over 23 years. So we started this research project in the kind of the wettest place in the British Isles. It's got the worst weather of anywhere in Britain, and she bravely lived there periodically over a few years, and we collected data from the observatory, and we tried to map them up. But something extraordinary happened, is that we started at the trough in the solar flare activity. So it was just at the start of a sunspot cycle, 23-year cycle, and then it just stayed at the bottom. So we had this weird, it's like the sun knew what we were doing and decided to thwart our research by not really budging its flare activity for the first time in a few hundred years, which was anomalous in itself.
Yeah.
So we didn't, even though we persisted for 3 or 4 years, we had a very poor kind of range of solar flare activity over that time period, because it stayed at this kind of very uncommon trough for a very long period of time. And we didn't find particularly much. I mean, our ESP experiments weren't particularly successful either. They'd been very successful with Tibetan Buddhist monks, particularly those who'd meditated for at least 20 years, like serious meditation. They got very good at our task. But when we tried doing that in Scotland, these were mostly Westerners in a monastery. And I think there's a lot of differences, cultural differences between them and Tibetans in India, So we didn't get very good results for a couple of reasons, but we did find a relationship between temporal lobe lability. So that's those people who have sensitivity in their temporal lobes. They more like to have anomalous experiences, like time slips or strange smells and this kind of thing. And their psi scores are in relationship to the solar fluctuations. So we picked up some kind of small signal, but we didn't get to thoroughly explore this relationship to the extent we'd hoped to.
What do you mean their psi scores?
So we looked at their scores in the clairvoyance and precognition tasks. So there was a relationship between solar activity or geomagnetic field strength, and there was a kind of 3-way relationship between people with the temporal lobe lability and their scores on the clairvoyance tasks. So it seemed like in combination with geomagnetic fields, those people who had temporal lobe lability tended to do well in the psi task. But other than that, we didn't get very much.
Is there a test for clairvoyance for psi?
Well, again, we developed a task much like, there's various experiments been done over the last 135 years.
Mostly with cards, right? Like those.
Yeah, those are a bit obsolete these days because they're somewhat banal, and abstract. So we try to use more static targets, more dynamic targets these days. So typically video clips or images, and we have like one target typically amongst a pool of decoys, so that you're trying to pick up some mental imagery, and you can try and match your mental imagery to the target, but you don't know what the actual target is, and you've got one of four choices.
So it's Gansfield.
Yeah, like the Gansfeld technique. So the actual protocols vary typically, but the general methodology is that you'll have one target embedded amongst three decoys, is the kind of classic way of looking at it. And obviously, the person doing the judging doesn't know what the target is, usually through automated processes or selecting the target in the future or so on. So that's the kind of typical paradigm we use for testing these kinds of things.
You've also looked at circadian rhythms. What did you find with that?
Yeah, so I was doing a dream ESP study, and again, this was looking into this hypothesis about the pineal gland and its possible production of DMT or sensitivity to geomagnetic fields and so on. Just the pineal gland as a neurobiological kind of or medium for psi experiences. And in this case, I was trying to explore the notion that as much as the pineal gland is very circadian organ, it produces serotonin in the day, and that gets converted into melatonin and penelin and other chemicals at night. So it's very much a highly circadian rhythm of activity, the pineal gland. Melatonin, of course, initiates sleep, and it's thought that serotonin made in the pineal could potentially be converted into DMT as well at night, and that may regulate dreaming, REM sleep, non-REM sleep, and so on. That's a hypothesis. It's not a given. We don't know that for certain. So I looked at Dream ESP. Again, it was a precognition task. Same thing, 4 decoys. And we woke people up in the middle of the night, like at 3 a.m., which is like that's peak melatonin production period. So like melatonin is typically 10 times more melatonin available in the brain at 3 a.m. in the morning as there is in the daytime. So we woke people up at 3 a.m. in the morning. They gave them a dream precognition task, and then when they woke up in the morning at 8 a.m., they had to do the task again, but a different task. So we compared 3 a.m. with 8 a.m., and we actually got an effect. People did better on the precognition task at 3 a.m. in the morning. So that was good. We found a trend in the we tried replicating that. We found the same trend, but it wasn't significant. So we didn't really replicate our findings, but I think it's still worth exploring some more. And that's kind of based on like some of the principles, like, in various meditation traditions, 3 to 4 a.m. is thought to be like the golden hour for meditation. It's also known as the witching hour. People have a lot of anomalous experiences at that time of night as well. And we don't know if that's kind of because of melatonin levels or what. So just trying to look at indirectly looking at neurobiology and circadian rhythms and how it relates to psi performance.
I was trained in the Berkeley Psychic Institute techniques, where they teach, clairvoyant and healing techniques, and they were very keen on the pineal gland. They felt that was what was activated. So we always did all our work from the 6th chakra, which they believed kind of tied in with the pineal.
Excellent, absolutely. I mean, it's not proven by any means, but there is a lot of kind of lore and folklore and a little bit of research and a lot of circumstantial evidence, pointing to the pineal gland. Yes, of course, and in the yogic traditions, of course, the 6th chakra, the Ajna chakra, is the kind of etheric counterpoint to the pineal gland as the physical concomitant to that chakra point. And of course, that chakra point controls your psychic powers, in yogic traditions. So there's various reasons to be looking to the pineal gland, I think, in exploring this phenomena. And everybody got very. I mean, Serena Roney-Dougal was probably one of the first people to kind of hypothesize that DMT could be produced in the pineal gland nocturnally, and possibly explain why the importance of the pineal gland as a psychic center. That hasn't been proven yet. There's still research going on. There's a lot of controversy and debate over whether or not the pineal gland does produce DMT, and if it does, is it producing enough to give us a mystical experience? But it's an interesting notion nonetheless.
You did your dissertation involving luck. What was that about?
Yeah, I think I wanted to look at psychedelics, but there was no one around at that time to supervise. It's very different now. But I was also interested in the nature of luck. I was primarily interested in it because, well, I'd had a lot of lucky experiences myself, but also there was this psychological paradigm in parapsychology called psi-mediated instrumental response, whereby it's thought that unconscious psychological processes would modulate your reception of psi information, or at least modulate your behavior and respond to it. So that, but because it's an unconscious process and it's very subtle, it might just kind of, incoming psi information just might change your behavior in very subtle ways so that you have fortuitous outcomes, right? In that sense, like psi might look like luck, if you know what I mean. So people go, oh, that was just lucky. It was actually unconscious psi processes which enabled you to have that lucky event.
How in the heck do you measure that?
Oh, yeah, well, that's the whole PhD's worth of work there. So I developed some measures about, first of all, I developed some scales. I tried to understand what different beliefs about luck were. I came up with a kind of a 4-scale measure. And then I gave people a task. They didn't know they were doing a precognition task, but there was an intrinsic reward in the task. So if they did well at the task, which they didn't know they were really doing, they were rewarded. First of all, if they did badly, they were kind of punished in a way by having to do this really, really boring cognitive psychology task. But if they were successful, if they got it right more than chance, this precognition task they didn't know they were doing, they were rewarded with erotic images. And the better they did at the unconscious precognition task, the more erotic the images got. And I also looked at people, I kind of looked at their erotic reactivity, first of all, and there was a good correlation, in fact. So people who liked looking at erotic images tended to do much better on this task.
Was that male people more than female people?
No, there was no gender differences. There were some differences in the kind of erotic images they wanted to look at. So, men tended to want to look at images of women. So did women, interestingly. They were less interested in looking at images of males, of naked men. Yeah, and those people who like looking at, the more people like looking at erotic images, the better they did. But there shouldn't be any relationship whatsoever, because it's an unconscious precognition task, whereby the results are coming from the future, So it should have been impossible by our kind of current scientific understanding, but we got some really nice results. And then myself and some other researchers have continued to replicate those findings over like 6 or 7 studies, and it's highly significant. Not hugely successful though. Relative to getting the target 25% of the time, we get a hit rate of about 28-29% over hundreds, in fact, thousands of trials. But enough that people are doing it more than you would expect by chance. And then I looked at people's beliefs about luck and in the first study, there was some signal there. It looked like people who tended to believe that luck was something controllable and that they were personally lucky tended to do better. But I didn't manage to replicate that, unfortunately. But I did kind of, sorry?
Is this tied in with synchronicity, luck?
Yeah, I think it is to some extent. I think synchronicity and luck overlap quite a lot. So synchronicity could just be another name for a lucky event. I mean,
Yeah.
you have a lucky event,
Yeah.
and if you're open to the notion of synchronicities, you go, "Oh, that was synchronistic." Otherwise, you might just go, "Oh, well, that was just some lucky coincidence, right?" But people use the term luck in different ways. Some people think it's synonymous with coincidence, i.e., luck is just random and inert. But other people, like gamblers in particular, think luck is something you can engender. It has a personality. You can entreaty it, and then synchronicity is just a way of, well, it's basically it's a meaningful coincidence. They're all coincidences of some kind. But luck to a gambler is a meaningful coincidence. Synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence, and to people who are deeply skeptic, a coincidence is just a lucky event, but it doesn't mean anything. So I think there is a.
That's why gamblers have like little rituals where they wear red socks or something.
Absolutely.
That's their lucky socks. So they think they can affect luck.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they think it's something is at least partially controllable, not completely, but you can try and you have rituals to kind of engender luck, and things you do to avoid bad luck.
Maybe a lot of religious rituals are like that too.
Yes, in a way, I guess they are. I mean, a lot of it is about, to some extent, more kind of magical rituals, I would say. But I mean, religious rituals are usually about kind of keeping the traditions and transmitting the cosmology to the followers, and kind of they have sociological aspects to them as well, about kind of group belonging, etc., etc. But if they have any particular aim, like healing or something like that, it's essentially an act of magic, and which involves a ritual practice with a specific intention or goal or aim.
Well, what I'm thinking of is the rituals of killing the king, so that it like crucifixion of Christ, killing the king, so that the crops will come again in the spring, making that kind of ritual sacrifice. So that's a magical act that
very much so.
You could say Christianity's based on it in a way.
Yeah. It's based on one magical ritual, which was the sacrifice of the living God. Yeah, to in rather than to ensure fertility of the crops, but more for the salvation of humanity. I mean, it's kind of like they've made a theology out of some magic rituals, basically, and then kind of ossified them in time, whereas a lot of magico-spiritual practices like shamanism, for instance, are kind of living traditions. So they're constantly doing rituals and ceremonies, but they're often dynamic and have a lot of creativity in them. So the shaman will there'll be a lot of spontaneity and creativity in how the rituals are done. Instead of repeating the same ritual as in a religious way, it's more dynamic, and you're responding to the requirements of the specific situation and need, and what's available at the time. Whatever information you're getting from the spirits at the time, or what the person's particular illness is. So it's much more dynamic and a kind of lived ritual, if you like, rather than a kind of just a kind of traditional reiteration of some former event,
like communion, or
exactly,
blood and body of Christ. So what is your next book? Are you it sounds like you should do something speaking for the indigenous people that you've studied with.
Yeah, actually, I had this idea a couple of days ago. Well, so I run this conference. I co-run it. Some colleagues called Breaking Convention. It's about psychedelic research and consciousness. And this year, for my symposia, I'm inviting 5 or 6 indigenous shamans from different parts of the world.
Wow.
And I was thinking of putting that together as a book, actually, transcribing their talks and putting some more stuff to it. But that would be more of a kind of their voices, again, like an edited book. I've got a couple of other books coming out this year. One is a collection of essays I co-edited on women and altered states and psychedelics. It's called Divine Mysteries of the Psychedelic Mysteries of the Divine Feminine. I can't remember what the title's called.
There's so many books.
Yeah, well, our publishers had a hand in the title. Divine Mysteries of Mysteries of the Psychedelic Mysteries of the Feminine. I think that was it. That's what it's called. Something like that. Some combination of that. This is terrible. You'll have to edit that bit out.
And then, so are you implying that it's a different experience than the masculine?
No, I mean, it's not any one opinion. It's just a collections of essays from lots of different writers and thinkers from different traditions and subject areas about the intersection of women and the feminine in altered states historically and currently, so looking at everything from, the Bacchantes and mystery traditions in ancient Egypt to Norse seers, to women in psychedelic research currently, or issues around Jungian anima and animus, and so on. So, elements of womanhood and the feminine in altered states and psychedelics throughout history and currently.
What I found interesting is that in the 19th century, the U.S., there were many women founders of religions, and they could do it because they could say, I'm just a vessel for the divine. I'm just a spokesperson for the divine. It's not me. I'm just transmitting this to you. So they could get around, well, women are lesser vehicles. They could, oh, maybe I'm a lesser vehicle, but I can be a channel. I'm thinking like Mary Baker Eddy and the Seventh-day Adventists and the Shakers. Bunch of women started religions.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, there's an interesting discourse which is a bit sticky, I think, around that, in that, for instance, like the Tsar cult in Sudan and Egypt and North Africa, it's primarily female cult. There are a few men, depending in different traditions, but it's mostly women. And so, the kind of the classic anthropological or sociological viewpoint is these are disempowered women in a kind of Islamic culture and societies, and so they find voice through this kind of cult where they negotiate with demons, and the men are usually kind of quite scared by kind of cult members, and so they become empowered through this ritual practice. But that kind of assumes that it's all completely meaningless, and they're not really communicating with spirits and so on and so forth. So there's an interesting discourse around notions of power and the feminine and spiritual practices, but that shouldn't necessarily negate the possibility that they really are communicating with spirits, or that it's a genuine magico-spiritual practice. It can be both, potentially,
Right.
Yeah.
What's the other book?
The other one's just another collection of essays from our psychedelic conference. But I am planning another book, and it's going to be more of a kind of personal journey through from kind of disbelief through nihilism into agnosticism, through my kind of journey from studying psychology over the last 30 years, and based upon my experiences. So each chapter will be a kind of a journey into some kind of extraordinary phenomena and increasing degrees of doubt about the nature of reality, or opening up to the kind of extraordinary nature of reality as I go. So it's going to be a bit of a personal odyssey.
It sounds fascinating. I'll be happy to give you my 2 cents if you want me to read as you go along.
Thank you very much. That's very, very kind.
Okay, just a few more questions. The world situation, growing inequality, more autocrats, maybe 12 years to turn around climate change. Are you an optimist or a pessimist?
Oh, God, it depends on the day. Yeah, I mean, I think, in some senses, the world is probably a better place in some respects. There's apparently less war now than any time in the last 100 years. And, in some ways, it's getting better. But I think we really are at a critical juncture. Rampant consumerism and capitalism and, this perpetual kind of notion of development on a planet with limited resources, and we are really in an era of awful ecocide, not just climate change, but ocean acidification, species extinction. For me, is the most awful thing. Habitat loss and so on. Species extinction is a one-way street. We might be able to turn around climate change, but once a species is dead, there's no bringing it back. And we're in the biggest wave of mass extinction in 140 million years. We're in the sixth mass extinction. It seems to be happening faster than previous extinctions, and it's almost certainly mostly man-made, right? So it's anthropogenic. That's awful. That means we are culpable, and I don't think there's anything. We can't just sit back and let this happen. But I am hopeful. There's an organisation like Extinction Rebellion. I don't know if you've heard of them. They started here in the UK in October, and they're probably one of the fastest growing non-violent direct action activism groups ever. Got about 100,000 people now interested in them. There's going to be mass actions in the city of London and elsewhere around Britain in April. And they give me a bit of hope that we can respond to the potential ecological systemic collapse that we're on the brink of. We may have already gone past a tipping point. We don't know. But we have to be hopeful. And the hope comes through action, not just sitting around being hopeful, So, but I'm inspired by the amount of people who are so very quickly willing to get on board and take action, actually. So we're all part of this movement, and it's growing very quickly. And I think, my research is somewhat indirect to all of that, but I think it plays a part in that all of this stuff, altered states and mystical experiences, is all about increasing connection. Psychedelic experiences, psychedelics work by increasing connectivity, both neurobiologically between different regions of the brain, psychologically between yourself, you within yourself, they help you connect to your shadow, the other parts of yourself. Sociologically, they help you connect with other people, they increase empathy and interconnectivity. Environmentally, they help us connect with nature. I've done research in that, showing that people who have taken psychedelics, have psychedelic experiences, have increased their eco-consciousness. They take up more gardening, they eat more better vegan diets, vegetarian, so on and so forth. And also they connect us, not just the environment, but to the cosmos as well, So, and that's not just psychedelics, that's all altered states. They increase our kind of connectivity with everything from the molecular to the cosmic, And I think that can be no bad thing. So I have hope that through researching altered states and increasing education around them, and through parapsychology as well, that we can understand ourselves better and increase our connection to everybody, every species on this planet, not just other humans, but all the other species. And we can maybe have its part to play in turning around what may be inevitable ecological systemic collapse, which is the single biggest problem I think we face.
Yeah, I don't know what they think we're going to do without bees. They're killing off The
Quite.
bees. Hello.
No.
I am really encouraged by Greta Thunberg, the British 16-year-old who's leading the school walkouts in areas that you're familiar with. Are kids walking out of school once a week to protest climate change?
Yeah, it's once every couple of weeks, but yeah, it started happening here. I think there was about 20 kids remained in our local school up the road. There was about 200 kids that went out on strike last time, and there was a handful of kids, presumably whose parents didn't agree to it, but they were in the minority. Like 10% of them stayed in school. So yeah, it's happening, and they're growing in numbers.
Yes, that's what encourages me.
Yeah, that was started by teenage girls. It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Teenage girls are going to save the world.
Oh yeah, I did a book called Brave: Young Women's Global Revolution about young women activists around the world. Okay, what do you do for fun in the face of all this deep thought and productive work?
I hang out with my family. I play with my daughter, and my work's kind of fun as well most of the time. As long as I'm not sat at a computer doing too much admin, it's generally fun. I mean, I give a lot of public lectures, and I love teaching, and I like to get out and about and get my hands dirty doing research. So it's all fun to me.
Do you walk or run or do something physical?
Not much, not as much as I should. No. I like to swim, do a bit of wild swimming, a bit of walking, but I don't get enough of that either. But I'm going to take a sabbatical next year, go to Mexico for 6 months.
Oh, wonderful.
And live at the beach and go up in the mountains. So I'm a bit of a man of extremes.
Then your daughter can learn Spanish.
Yeah, I've already started her on Spanish cartoons.
Oh, good. Is there anything else? I think we've covered a lot of territory, but is there anything else you think should be in the chapter?
No, I think you've done a wonderful job, very thorough, and I really look forward to it. And I'd like to see some more of your work as well. So thank you very much, Gail. Is there anything you'd recommend?
Yeah, with Serena's, the woman who studied the yogis and how do you spell her last name? Because maybe she should be.
Yeah, no, you should, absolutely. Let me see if I can it's Serene. I can send it to you here, look.
Okay, I'm going to